Welcome, Kate, to the podcast. We're so happy to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Now, you have a new book out this week with Broadway as a backdrop. So that, of course, got our attention immediately. Tell us all about See the Light.
So, See the Light is the story of an aspiring Broadway actor named Jeremy who's just been dumped, and he moves in with his best friend who has been holding a torch for him for quite a while, and they have some romance. So Jeremy's an aspiring actor, and he gets his big break in the course of the novel, and Max is a theatrical makeup artist, so they're both involved in theater in some way.
What was your inspiration for the book?
So a bunch of things happened all at the same time. So I saw Dear Evan Hansen on Broadway about a year ago, and was obsessed because, like, the music is amazing. I walked out of the theater and immediately downloaded the cast recording to my phone so that I could listen to it on the subway ride home. Like, just the whole thing. It's such a great show. And then around the same time, I got back in touch with a kid that I used to babysit who is 28 now, so he's not a kid, but he's also an aspiring actor, and he lives in another city, but he comes to New York every spring. Well, I guess audition season starts about now, but he like couch surfs in the city and does all these auditions. So he was telling me what the process is like. And I was like, well, that's really, I never would have guessed. Like, basically most Broadway auditions happen in this like very short period of time. And he was just like doing 3 or 4, like just showing up for 3 or 4 auditions a day. And I thought that was really interesting. And then I had to come up with a story for this second novel that I owed Karina Press. So I was sitting down to brainstorm one day, and I had a RuPaul's Drag Race marathon on in the background. So I think that's how the makeup artist got into it.
Okay.
So I was just sitting here like just brainstorming, and the story sort of came together that way. And so it was all these different elements. And then last year I saw more theater than I have in a while. So which was awesome and amazing. And I'm so glad that I got the opportunity to see all these shows. I mean, especially since I live in New York and I don't go to Broadway that often, all things considered. So, so that was a big part of like all those things kind of gelling at the same time is sort of what produced the book.
And it's clear that you love musicals. You could just tell that from the book itself. It's layered up with all these details and all these show references. And yet I don't think it's too much that people who are maybe like on Broadway won't go, oh God, what's this? It's like you didn't overwrite it at the same time.
Yeah, I hope that, I mean, that's true too. Like I tend to sort of go all in on settings. So like, I always worried about that with out in the field in baseball too. Like, is this a little too much detail? But then people, as long as you understand the story, I think that's what matters. And then there's all those references there so that people who are Broadway fans can be like, oh, I know what that is.
And you went so far to actually do a complete song list. There's a blog post on your site where you detail like the entire song list behind See the Light. And, you know, the plot is heavily detailed in the book. What led you to create so much detail?
So I wanted to like really flesh out the whole story. Like I had to know for myself what the musical was about. And for those of you who haven't read the book yet, it's sort of a cross between Dear Evan Hansen and Love, Simon, and then the Parkland shooting kids get involved because that was happening while I was writing the book. So it all these different elements and I wrote out the story. And then when I originally pitched the story to Karina, one of the things that they really responded to was that the show had some parallels with the plot of the book. So I wanted to make sure that I knew what those parallels were when I was writing so that it would be like really clear what that was. And so I needed to know for myself what the plot of this musical was. I knew that I'd be referring to it. I felt like I needed to know the song names. I don't know. I have a lot of notes for all of my projects that sometimes make it into the book and sometimes don't. But I thought that in this case, it was useful for me to know like who was singing when, who the different parts were, which actor played which part. And I have like several pages of notes with all of this information in it so that, and I had my notebook with me for reference while I was writing. And so all of that sort of got woven into the story. And, so I wanted to, I don't know, just make sure that I like stories that have a lot of detail to them. So I like to reflect that in my writing. So that was a big reason why. And even I think, like, I teach a class on world building, and I always tell writers, like, even if it doesn't make it into the story, the fact that you know it will sort of be reflected in how you write about your characters. So yeah, I like to have that information.
Yeah. Now, in the book, when the character Jeremy gets his big break in See the Light, Max is also working on a different show at the same time, like a big,
Yeah.
splashy, expensive fantasy show called Sword of Dawn. How much detail did you come up with that show?
Much less. I didn't flush that out nearly as much. I mean, it's kind of the whole show is, that show is sort of a mashup of high fantasy tropes. So it's kind of like Lord of the Rings meets Game of Thrones meets Wheel of Time, just like all kind of got meshed together. And I have a list of like who the creatures are that Max was making makeup for, but I don't know what the plot of that show is. I think it's like, I'm sure it's like a pretty typical hero's journey kind of plot. But I also felt like it was a less important show, so I didn't need to know as much about it. But I just mostly what I needed to know was what kind of creatures Max was making, and then I drew a lot from Julie Taymor for that, because I thought, well, there probably puppets get involved, and I've seen a few Julie Taymor productions, and they have these just amazing costumes, and they're really elaborate, and they're she did the Magic Flute at the Met opera a few years ago, or not, this was probably 10 years ago, and the costumes for that were really amazing. So I was trying to keep all of that in mind, but yeah, I don't know what the plot is for that.
As I was reading, I really wanted the dragon to be on the scale of King Kong, since Kong is all the thing on Broadway right
cool.
now.
I think in my head it's sort of like proportionally like what, you know, like a Chinese dragon in a parade. It's sort of that size, but that, like, yeah.
And it's interesting.
Be one person. I don't know.
It's interesting watching Jeremy and Max on their trajectories to each other while they're both going for essentially their big breaks. It's certainly the big break for Jeremy, and Max too is. I mean, it's going to be a big deal for his studio to work on this project.
Right. And I felt like they're, you know, I think they're at the point in their lives when, like, you sort of start getting your first real big success, like, you know, especially if it's something you've been working for a long time. And I don't know, I thought, and also I think I just needed a really happy ending. So, like, I needed everything to kind of work out for the characters when I was writing the book. So
the big question here is, if the book itself was to be made into the musical, who are you casting as Jeremy and Max?
Okay, so I think for Jeremy, I would pick somebody who's kind of like more clean cut. I think for Jeremy, I would pick a Gavin Creel or an Aaron Tveit. And then for Max, I was thinking maybe Ben Platt, but like, that's not a great fit. But then I was running out of Broadway actors I could think of. So I'm terrible at casting these kinds of things because my characters, like, they don't, like, they're so specific in my head that I can never find actors who really look like who the characters are. So
spinning back to your beginnings, what got you started in romance?
So I think my path is a little bit less traditional. I don't know. I have an English lit degree, and after college I was a little bit of a snob about books for a while, but I got back into reading genre fiction when I was like in my mid-20s. And I got my start reading mysteries again, and then I kind of dipped my toe into romance via romantic suspense first. So two things kind of happened at the same time. I was reading Suzanne Brockman's Troubleshooter series and got to the Jules Robin storyline around the same time that I read a book review online for Josh Lanyon's Adrian English series. And so I read both those books. This was like in the gay romance dark ages, so this is maybe 2008, 2009. And I read those both around the same time, and I liked them so much that I then went and tried to find whatever other gay romance existed, and there was not a lot at the time, so I thought, well, I guess I have to write one. And it's funny, too, because I never intended for all of my books to have gay pairings. It's just sort of worked out that way in terms of my career so far. But it's just like those are the stories that have come into my head. But that's sort of where I was coming from. And I think that I also, one of the things I like about gay romance is that it's happy endings for characters that you haven't seen a lot in romance novels or in other stories prior to this. And, you know, I read a lot of LGBT fiction in college, and it all ends in unbearable tragedy. So it's nice to see like these happier stories happen. So that's sort of how I arrived at it. And I love romance novels. I love love stories, and I don't know why I thought that I was above writing them for a while, but yeah, I love the genre, and I want to keep writing in it. So that's where I am right now.
Were you writing before in other genres, or was it really these books that inspired you to write in general?
No, I had been writing before. I started writing. I mean, I've been writing stories forever. I wrote a novel when I was 17 that I'm sure was hot garbage. And then after college, I was dipping my toe into writing. Like, I thought I was writing the great American novel, and then it wasn't. That also wasn't very good. And I had a lot of false starts. And then I figured out that I was writing romance, so I wrote a couple of romantic suspense novels that were also hot garbage. And then it just happened that, like, I decided one year, like January 1st, I was like, this is the year I'm going to finish a novel and submit it to a publisher. And that book was In Hot Pursuit, which was my first published novel. And so, and I probably had written and not published like a half dozen books before that just like were not good enough to see the light of day. And then this book, I finally felt like I had something that was good enough to submit somewhere. So that, yeah, but I'd been writing, like my first few attempts at romance were het romances, and I'm developing a het romance series right now, actually, but I don't know what's happening with that at the moment. So no more details on that for now.
I believe I read too, and correct me if I'm wrong, In Hot Pursuit's getting ready to re-release, right?
Yeah, because Lucid closed last year, and I had two books that were still with Lucid that the rights reverted to, and I've been very slow about putting them back out because like I was so busy last year. But I finally was like, no, I have to get this done now. So I decided that I wanted to get In Hot Pursuit out on its publication anniversary, which is in February. So yeah, it's uploaded everywhere. I'm still waiting for it to show up in all the stores, and then it'll be up for pre-order coming out for real in February. And I didn't change this edition very much. It's like I read through it and fixed anything that was like goofy or like the character still had flip phones because I wrote it in 2009, or like anything weird. Like I fixed a couple of those things, but the story is pretty substantially the same.
Who are your major author influences?
So I have two answers for this, which are, I have like the elitist snobby answer, and then I have like the better answer. But one thing that I think a lot about in my writing. So I wrote my thesis on Toni Morrison, and one of the things that happens in her books that I really appreciate is that, like, as she publishes more books, she becomes more confident in herself as a writer. So, for example, in The Bluest Eye, which was her first novel, it's very, like, she kind of spells everything out for you. Like, the metaphor's a little bit, like, on the nose, and it's more telling and less showing. But by the time she gets to Beloved or Paradise, she's leaving much more up to the reader to interpret. So I try to think about that when I'm writing. Like, I never want to hit the reader over the head. I want to sort of, like, here's the story. You can interpret it however you want. I also have a ton of favorite romance writers. My particular romance drug of choice are historical romances, which are not like super directly influential because I'm kind of doing a different thing. But I love writers like Laura Kinsale is one of my favorites of all time, or Sarah MacLean. I don't read as much romantic suspense as I used to, but I love Suzanne Brockman. Like, she's one of my writer heroes. And there are a lot of earlier gay romance authors that I really appreciate, like J.A. Maxfield, I think, was one of the first writers I ever discovered. Or I read Faith and Fidelity a million, like, before I even met Terry Michaels, and I love Heidi Cullinan's earlier books too. Everything I read probably influences me in some way. I think by this point I've really developed my own voice and my own style, but yeah, I just love all those books. Mm-hmm. I wish I had more time for reading because I really just don't anymore.
So many books. What's the trademark of a Kate McMurray book?
Well, I think that I really like to try to really feel immersed in the worlds that I'm creating. So I do a ton of research, and I really want books to have strong settings, and I think that's really what you'll find, whether like regardless of what genre I'm dabbling in. And I try to write characters that aren't like I'm probably not ever going to publish a billionaire book. You know what I mean? Like I try to sort of write characters that are pretty down to earth. So I think those are my trademarks.
Yeah, certainly for me in See the Light, it's very clear you know New York well. I mean, obviously you lived there anyway, but
Yeah.
I envisioned easily everywhere we were.
Yeah. Well, and I live in Brooklyn, and Brooklyn I feel like doesn't make its way into books very often. And then I put Max's apartment right where a friend of mine lives, and she and her fiance live in this apartment that's like it's tiny, but the building is amazing. So I'm always like, and it's like right behind the Barclays Center. One of the things happening in Brooklyn right now is there's so much gentrification, and I live in like not at all cool Brooklyn. So it's sort of a different. I've sort of pictured that was where Jeremy and his ex's apartment was sort of where I live now, and he's sort of, and it's a very subtle, like you would only get this if you live in New York kind of thing. But he ends up moving to this apartment near the Barclays Center, which is in a part of Brooklyn that's developing like crazy right now, and it's all fancy, and there's like a Whole Foods and a Trader Joe's, and it's like it's a million poke bowl places. Like that's like it's a weird thing that's happening in downtown Brooklyn right now. So that was sort of like on the brain when I was picking the setting. And I feel like Brooklyn, as I experience it, is just like never shows up in books. So I wanted to make sure that was in there somewhere.
Yeah, it was nice to not just get all New York all the time. New York City, Manhattan proper anyway. We'll call it Manhattan in this case.
Because, I mean, I also just, like, from a logical perspective, Manhattan is, like, so bonkers expensive that, like, an aspiring actor who doesn't work that much would not be able to afford an apartment there. So, and I've read that book, too, where there's a character who, like, lives on the 17th floor on a building on the Upper West Side with a doorman, and I was like, there's no way on earth this character could afford that. Stuff like that really bugs me, so I always try to be really realistic with New York details in the books that I'm writing.
Are there tropes or subgenres that you want to play with that you haven't yet?
So I really want to write more historical romance. I've written two, but I want to write more. And I really love the idea of writing American set historicals, and this is one of my crusades. Is I just want there to be more books set in the States. And right now, like just generally speaking, not even specifically gay romance, but romance generally, is so heavily dominated by Regency romance. And I love a Regency romance. This is not a knock on them at all, but I want to see more other kinds of books. Like just as a reader, I'd like to read them, but I want to write more historicals too, because I'm a huge history nerd and I want to like incorporate that into it. But I also have a crazy idea for a paranormal series that I'd like to write at some point. I don't know when that will be, but I like the idea of following the same couple through the whole series. That's something I'd like to attempt at some point. I don't know when that will be, but yeah,
somewhere
that's
out there
something
in the future.
somewhere. Yeah, I'm young. I have time.
Well, speaking of time, people may not know that besides the writing, I mean, you're also heavily involved in the author community. You're the former president of the Rainbow Romance Writers, and you're also the current president of the New York City Romance Writers of America chapter. Why is all of that important to you to take on those roles? I'm
actually currently the past president of the New York chapter. It's still a voting position. I still go to board meetings and stuff, but I don't get to be the president anymore. They have term limits. They made me leave. But I mean, it's interesting. New York has this like really great romance community, and when I was first starting to write, I participated in NaNoWriMo many times, and I used to be the liaison for New York City. And through that, I met some women who were members of the local RWA chapter, and they kind of talked me into joining. And for like a year, I didn't do anything with my membership. I was just like, oh, it's fine. Like, it's a thing I belong to, and I paid my dues. But then a weird thing happened where there was a scandal, and I don't remember all of the details, but the gist of it is that there was this RWA chapter that disinvited gay romance authors from submitting to their contest, and it was a big scandal. And I think by then I was already a member of Rainbow Romance Writers, and this might have been when Heidi Cullinan was the president. It might have been the year before that. I don't remember. Time just like blends together. But around the time that was happening, the president of the New York City chapter released a statement where she said basically that the New York's contest would always be open to everyone. And I thought, well, that's really nice. And then it came up in the schedule that Terry Michaels was going to be a guest speaker, and I had never met her before at the time. But I had read Faith and Fidelity, and I was really excited that there was a gay romance author who was going to be speaking. So I finally went to the meeting, and now Terry's one of my best friends. But through that meeting, I was like, oh, well, this is exciting. And I met all these really great people and these writers who were just like at all different stages of their careers, and it was just a really great experience. And the local chapter does a bunch of networking events and educational programs, and I learned a ton, and I got to meet all these great people. And the amazing thing about living in New York is that this is where publishing is. So I got to meet all these editors and agents, and I had all these great opportunities. And then I decided to run for the board because after I'd gotten all that, I wanted to give something back and volunteer my time, and also because Damon Swade and Heidi Cullinan got me drunk on margaritas and talked me into running for the RW board.
Oh, you should never be drunk around those two, because you never know what's going to happen.
Because then they'll talk you into something. But that's what happened. And so I ran for the Rainbow Romance Writers Board. And one of the things I realized being a part of that chapter is that I realized that I could affect real change. And because one of the stated missions of that chapter was to advocate for LGBTQ romance writers, and each year the president kind of has a big agenda item with the way we were setting it up. And so when I was president of the chapter, I was really interested in doing library outreach and finding out how to get more LGBTQ books into libraries and what the impediments to that were, and letting librarians know that we existed. And so that was a big deal to me. And I talked to bookstores too. I talked to a lot of indie bookstores and about how, and sort of learning, this is changing, but for a long time, indie bookstores wouldn't stock romance at all. Despite the fact that they've hosted a whole bunch of romance panels now, the Strand still doesn't really have romance in their bookstores at all, which is crazy to me.
There's everything else in there.
I know, it's well, and they've had once a quarter or so for the last year and a half, maybe, they've had these panels of romance writers at the store, and so and they stock those books, and they last for as long as those copies are there, but they don't really have a romance section. But anyway, I was doing a lot of that kind of work, and then this opportunity to run for the board of the local chapter happened, and New York is such a great, it's a great community of writers, but the New York chapter is super diverse in terms of the races of the people who are members, in terms of gender, sexuality, in terms of what people are writing, everything from inspirationals to erotic romance and all the things in between, in terms of indie and traditional and not published yet and have made bestseller lists. It's this great community, and I really wanted to foster that. And this also has let me, getting involved in RWA has also let me do some work to advocate for more diversity in the romance genres generally, which I think makes the genre better. The more voices we have, the better the genre is. And so that's sort of what I'm working toward. And I'm currently serving on several committees within RWA. I hope to run for the board again, the national board, at some point in the future. But yeah, it's been just a really rewarding experience. So I enjoy being involved with that. Plus, it's good to have writer friends, just people you can talk to about what you're going through, what you're doing, people who hold you accountable, all of that stuff. And so, yeah, it's really good to have that community.
You also teach as part of this giving back. How did that kind of get started?
Career background. I work in publishing in my other life, but I had wanted to teach for a while, and I applied to grad school and then decided I didn't want to go to school anymore. So I ended up not going to school for teaching, but I thought about it, and then I did some volunteer work where I was helping kids. I worked with an organization in New York that was helping kids get into college, and I really just liked teaching. And then I got this opportunity that happened for the GRL that was in Atlanta, and that was again, Heidi and Damon sat me down and were like, "So you're going to do this." I don't think I was drunk that time, but we were at dinner, and I wound up taking the lead in putting together the writer's track for that GRL. That was when I was the vice president of Rainbow Romance Writers, and Rainbow Romance Writers were sort of sponsoring the writer's track. So they told me, like, well, you should teach a class, and so I thought about, like, well, so what am I good at, and what can I teach? And then that was really the first time that I'd done a workshop at a writing conference, and then after that, I just, I put proposals together, and I mean, I have to give Damon a lot of credit because he's talked me into a lot of these things. But he's always right. Like, there are such great opportunities both to, like, just to get back into, share knowledge, but also, to meet a lot of new writers. I'm teaching, I think, I'm only doing 2 cons this year, which is way less than usual. But I'm teaching workshops at both of them. So it's the same workshop, though. So hopefully that'll be fine.
Now, besides See the Light and In Hot Pursuit coming back out, what else do we have to look forward to in 2019 from you?
Well, 2019 is a little slow. It's funny, the way the publishing works is that if you have a year where you don't write very much, there's a weird ripple effect. So 2016, I know, was a dumpster fire for everyone. It was a particularly bad year for me because I moved in the middle of it, and like I didn't write for like 4 months, and so we're sort of feeling the reverberations of that now because I don't have much on the schedule. But what I'm planning right now is I have another Lucid book, which is a novella called Save the Date, that I would like to get back out it's also out of print. I'd like to get that back up like June-ish, hopefully, is the schedule right now. It's a novella. I've expanded it a little bit. I don't think it's going to end up being novel length. I think it's probably going to be between 40,000 and 50,000 words, but it's a romantic comedy about a wedding. And then it's a weird personal story for me because I wrote that novella when my ex got married, and so it was sort of my way of like dealing with it, but at the same time it's a comedy. So there's that. But then so I hope to get that out around June, fingers crossed. It sort of depends on how the rest of my schedule goes. And then I want to release another novella probably in the fall, but I don't know what that is yet. It's more sort of a like filler in the hole in my publication schedule. Mm-hmm. I have some ideas, but I don't know yet. But I'm going to be putting that out myself, so I have a little time to decide still.
And we can also look out into 2020 because it was recently announced that you've got some stories coming out to align with the Olympics. And it all starts with something called Here Comes the Flood.
So I'm so excited for the series. I can't even tell you. I am a nerd about a lot of things, so musicals, but also sports. And I love the Olympics. And so Here Comes the Flood is a book about one hero is an alcoholic swimmer who hit rock bottom, had a few DUIs, and then for this Olympics has decided to stage a comeback. And then the other hero is a diver who's gotten a lot of tabloid attention and is not that into it and just sort of like wants to get through the games and do his thing and go home and not have anyone bother him. And so I wrote this book during the 2016 Olympics, the Summer Olympics, because it really was, I woke up one morning and this whole story was in my head. And like I literally like in my pajamas crossed the apartment and sat at my desk and wrote it all out, like wrote out a synopsis. And I've been sitting on the manuscript for a while, and then I was shopping for agents, and there was a lot of minutia with scheduling. And then when I sat down and pitched it to Lynn West at Dreamspinner, and she was like, "Oh my God, give me!" So it's a 3-book series. They're all coming out in 2020. The first one I think is out in the spring, but I don't remember the pub date offhand. So Here Comes the Flood will be out in the spring. Book 2 is going to be called Stick the Landing. It's about a gymnast. And then book 3 has a title I don't remember offhand. It's like Race for Redemption or something like that, and it's about a track runner. So those will be out next summer. And then I actually have another trilogy coming out in 2021 that are very loosely based on. I've been signing lots of contracts. This is why I wanted to write a novella this year, so that like there's lots of stuff happening. But the 2021 trilogy is sort of based on a fake HGTV, so it's about like people who renovate houses on television. And then if the gods are nice to me, I want to release another trilogy of Olympics books for the Winter Olympics in 2022, but I don't have that contracted yet. It's just sort of in the vague future plans list. I'm really excited, and the Olympics books have been really fun to write. I just finished the second one. I have a draft done. I have to revise it still, but there's that one I think is going to be really fun. And I got to be super nerdy about gymnastics, so... And it turns out that if you ever need to know what any gymnastics move looks like, they're all on YouTube. So
Oh, for sure. Everything's on YouTube.
Everything's on YouTube. So I watched a lot of gymnastics videos on YouTube when I was writing this book. I'm worried at this point that there's a little too much and I have to tone it back a little, but because people are going to be like, what are all these Russian words? Like they're all the names in gymnastics, like all these release moves and stuff all have names, but...
That can go in the deleted scenes.
Yeah. Here's all the extra stuff that you don't care about.
So what's the best way to keep up with you online so folks can follow along with all these releases coming out?
I am the most active on Twitter. My handle is at Kate McM Writer. You can find all this on my website. I'm on Facebook sometimes, and I joined Instagram last fall. It's mostly pictures of my cat, but all of my usernames and stuff are on my website, and you can find me from there, which is just katemcmurray.com.
All right, fantastic. Well, Kate, thank you so much for hanging out with us. It's been great to hear about See the Light, plus everything else that's coming up soon.
You're welcome.